Hello everyone, this is Robin Warder, and I just wanted to provide this quick introduction to mention that since I am currently moving to a new place, I decided to take this week off, and The Trail Went Cold will not be releasing a new episode. However, as a substitution, we decided to drop this exclusive bonus episode which we released on our Patreon page 3 years ago, and make it available to the general public. It covers the strange death of a woman named Kay Hall, and if you're an Unsolved Mysteries fan, you're probably familiar with it, but you might not know the full story. Anyway, we'll be back to our usual schedule and dropping an all-new episode next Wednesday, December the 1st, but until then, I hope you enjoy this little bonus. September 30th, 1987. Northumberland County, Virginia. The body of 45-year-old Kay Hall is discovered on a back road underneath her pickup truck. She has been run over, and her husband, Bob Hall, immediately becomes the prime suspect. Even though Bob stood to collect on an inheritance Kay had just received, and there are issues with his alibi, there is some question about whether he would have been able to commit the crime during a very narrow time frame. Bob is eventually charged and convicted of Kay's murder, but has his conviction overturned, and after agreeing to enter an Alford plea, he is released from prison. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to this month's bonus Patreon episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be chronicling another case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1987 death of Kay Hall. Now, I found that some of the ideal stories for these bonus episodes are cases which are officially solved, but also leave you asking the question, or are they? In other words, they're cases in which you're not entirely sure if the trail went cold. Today's featured story deals with the controversial murder conviction of Bob Hall, who was sent to prison for running over his wife, Kay, with her own pickup truck. On the surface, this is one of those cases where you would instantly jump to the conclusion the husband did it. There were serious problems with the marriage, and Kay just happened to be killed on the very same day she received an inheritance which Bob would collect on if she died. Even though Bob was convicted of Kay's murder, he would walk out of prison because of the one thing which is considered the antithesis for full resolution in a criminal case, the Alford plea. In case you're not familiar with the term, an Alford plea is essentially the act of pleading guilty while maintaining your innocence. When a defendant enters the plea, they're not admitting guilt for the crime they've been charged with, but they are acknowledging that the prosecution would have enough evidence to convict them if they went to trial. Some of the most high-profile criminal cases of the modern era have ended with an Alford plea, and in this particular case, it allowed Bob Hall to become a free man after serving less than 2 years for murder. No matter how you look at it, it's an unsatisfying resolution. If Bob was innocent, then he never got the opportunity to clear his name. If he was guilty, then he got off way too easy for killing his wife. There are definitely some good reasons to be suspicious of Bob, but if the case against him was airtight, he never would have been allowed to enter an Alford plea to begin with. The big unanswered question is whether Bob would have had enough time to commit the crime, so this episode is going to explore that angle, and you're going to hear a lot of additional information which wasn't mentioned during the Unsolved Mystery segment. So without any further ado, let us now discuss the bizarre death of Kay Hall. Our story begins in Virginia in 1987. Our central figure is 45-year-old Kay Hall, who lives with her 48-year-old husband, Bob Hall. The couple have a very unique relationship, as they essentially got together after becoming prison pen pals. While they first met during the early 1970s, it was not until Bob was arrested for selling drugs and received a 2-year prison sentence that they seemed to develop a closer bond. Kay and Bob continually corresponded during his incarceration, and when he was released in January of 1982, she was waiting for him outside the prison gates in order to pick him up. Kay brought Bob home to live with her, and pretty much financially supported him as they began a serious relationship before getting married in 1985. The couple lived in Marypoint, a community located in Lancaster County, and their home was on the shores of the Chirotamid River. Even though Kay had a successful career as an insurance executive, she decided to leave that behind to open an oyster farming business with Bob. However, within 6 months, the business ran into serious financial difficulties. Kay ultimately lost around $100,000 and completely exhausted the assets of her retirement fund. Bob wound up declaring bankruptcy, and his interest in their home would be sold to satisfy a tax lien. Kay subsequently purchased Bob's interest in an Internal Revenue delinquent tax sale. This whole situation had a negative impact on the marriage, as Kay and Bob both started to drink heavily and were constantly fighting. Kay even went so far as to tell one of her friends that Bob was physically abusive towards her, and numerous people remembered seeing Kay with bruises and black eyes. Even though the relationship was in a very bad place, the Halls were planning to go to marriage counseling, though Kay was definitely ready for a divorce if that didn't work out. However, an unexpectedly positive development took place on September 30th, 1987, when Kay learned she was going to inherit $50,000, which would help her financial issues. That morning, Kay immediately transferred half the money into her bank account. When evening hit, both she and Bob went to a party at the Indian Creek Country Club, located 14 miles from their home. The sudden good fortune put Kay in a jovial mood, and her friends described her as being the life of the party that night. However, both she and Bob continued to partake in some heavy drinking, which eventually led to another argument. The breaking point seemed to be when Kay got angry with Bob after he gave the bartender an unusually large tip, which prompted her to storm out of the country club shortly after 8 p.m. When Bob went outside into the parking lot to look for her, he discovered Kay's pickup truck was gone, and that she had left him stranded without a ride. When the party ended, Bob got another couple to drive him home, and they dropped him off at 8:45. But sometime within the next hour, Kay would be killed. At around 9:55 p.m., 2 carloads of people leaving a party in Northumberland County came across Kay's pickup truck. It was parked on Bluff Point Road, a dead-end back road located 2 miles east from the Indian Creek Country Club. They were shocked to discover Kay's body under the truck's tires. She had been run over and crushed to death. The keys were in the truck's ignition, the engine was still running, the lights were on, and the transmission was in park. It appeared that someone had backed over Kay's torso with the left rear tire. The driver then attempted to apply the brakes and stop the truck, but it wound up skidding, causing the left front tire to catch Kay's torso and pull her backwards, which twisted her body into an awkward position. Since Kay's body was still warm, her death had taken place a short time before her body was discovered. When police and paramedics were summoned to the scene, they discovered what appeared to be signs of a scuffle inside the cab of the truck, as Kay's broken necklace and 3 fake fingernails were on the seat and floor. Even though an autopsy would later reveal that Kay was heavily intoxicated and had a blood alcohol content of 0.27%, investigators did not believe her death was an accident. And since Kay was not sexually assaulted, and her purse was found inside the truck with nothing taken from it, this did not appear to be a random act of murder. The lead investigator on the case, Virginia State Police Special Agent David Riley, immediately became suspicious of Bob Hall. At approximately 1 a.m., 3 hours after Kay was found, a state trooper arrived at the Hall residence to inform Bob about Kay's death. While the trooper told Bob that Kay had been killed in an accident, he did not provide any specific details. When Special Agent Riley showed up at the residence shortly thereafter, Bob told him that Kay had been run over with a truck, even though the exact cause of death had not yet been shared with Bob. Of course, Bob immediately became the prime suspect once Riley learned about the tumultuous nature of the Hall's marriage, and that Kay had inherited $50,000 on the exact same day she died. Bob now stood to collect part of that money, and he could also potentially inherit a number of Kay's other financial assets. When investigators spoke to Kay's friends, They theorized that Bob killed her because she threatened him with a divorce, and since she owned controlling interest in their home, a divorce would have left Bob with nothing. Bob maintained that he had no interest in Kay's death, and initially claimed that he never left the house at all after he was driven home from the country club. However, Bob's Jeep was still parked at the house when police first arrived there, and they noticed that its engine was still warm. When confronted with this, Bob changed his story and said that when he arrived home and noticed Kay was not there, he drove to the end of his lane and back in order to perform a quick search for her. Special Agent Riley later decided to call Bob's bluff and tell him someone had seen him in the town of Kilmarnock, which is located about halfway between the Hall residence and the location where Kay was killed. This prompted Bob to change his story again, and he now said that he made a quick drive to the Lancaster courthouse. Since Kay was intoxicated when she left the country club, he was concerned that she may have been arrested for a DUI, but when he noticed that her pickup truck was not in the courthouse parking lot, he immediately drove back home. Well, the discrepancies in Bob's story raised some major red flags, and he technically had no alibi during the approximate 1-hour time period when Kay was killed, but the issue with building a case against him is that he had a pretty narrow window of time in which he could have committed the crime. It was confirmed that Bob was driven home from the country club and dropped off at 8:45 p.m., and phone records showed that Bob made a 5-minute long-distance phone call from the house to his daughter in Maryland at 9:47, only about 10 minutes before Kay's body was discovered. So if Bob was guilty, he would have had to drive around 16 miles from his house to the end of Bluff Point Road, murdered Kay, and then driven back home again to place the phone call in a time frame of only 1 hour. The other issue was that the Hall residence was 14 miles west of the Indian Creek Country Club, while the location where Kay was found was 2 miles east in the opposite direction. After she left the country club, the last confirmed sighting of Kay took place at 8:50 p.m., as a homeowner from the area claimed that she saw Kay run over a boxwood on someone's lawn and nearly drive into a swimming pool before she backed up and drove away. It was unclear why Kay wound up at that particular spot on Bluff Point Road, or if Bob could have known where to find her. Special Agent Riley drove the 16-mile route from the Hall residence to the end of Bluff Point Road and back again on multiple occasions. Depending on how fast he was driving, each trip usually took between 17 to 24 minutes. This left Bob with a window of around 15 to 25 minutes to murder Kay, so he theoretically had enough time to commit the crime, but the problem was that there was no hard evidence placing Bob at the scene. There were no witnesses who recalled seeing Bob's Jeep in the area, and in fact one witness who lived near Bluff Point Road remembered seeing Kay's pickup truck drive past her house that night, but claimed she saw no other vehicles pass by until the police and paramedics arrived. In December of 1988, a bizarre incident took place when Bob called up Special Agent Riley for a meeting because he, quote-unquote, wanted a Christmas present. Riley tape-recorded their conversation where Bob said he hoped the case could be solved by Christmas because he was starting a relationship with another woman. When Riley informed Bob that he was the only logical suspect, Bob proposed a scenario where the newspapers could publish a story stating that Kay's death was an accident, which might prompt her killer to come forward. Bob then said that hypothetically, if he were the killer and needed motivation to come forward, his terms would include a legal document from the Commonwealth Attorney which declared Kay's death to be an accident and guaranteed no charges or consequences for anyone who confessed to the crime. Riley got the sense that Bob might have been itching to make a confession, so he played along with this. When Riley said, quote, "If I went out and got such a document and put Bob Hall's name on it, then would you like to see it?" End quote. And then Bob replied, "Before Christmas." This next part is so strange that I have to read an exact word-for-word excerpt from an official decision by the Virginia Court of Appeals. Quote, "Hall told Riley that if Riley really wanted to make it tempting as hell to me, he should call Hall's attorney to inquire if Hall could still collect under the uninsured motorist provisions of his automobile insurance if he had accidentally killed his wife." End quote. Yes, you heard that right. Bob was wondering if he could collect insurance money from Kay's death, even if he was the one responsible. Anyway, Riley started to write out the conditions of this hypothetical legal document, which included no criminal prosecution, no loss of his driver's license, no loss of financial benefits, and no public mention of his name. Believe it or not, Bob then suggested an additional provision in which he could burn down his current home and use the insurance money to build a new house for his current girlfriend. When Riley said he could not include that in the document because it was a crime, Bob replied, quote, "I bet I could do it in such a way they'll say it was an accident, just like we're doing in this. No difference." End quote. Anyway, as you probably guessed, this document Bob proposed never came to fruition, and he never did make an official confession to Kay's death. Bob would later state that he never meant any of the things he said about burning down his house or collecting on Kay's insurance. He was just leading Riley on to see where he was in the investigation and making a genuine effort to devise a strategy which might prompt the real guilty party to come forward and confess to Kay's death. The investigation continued to remain at a standstill until the case was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in October of 1989. The segment brought in over 250 tips, but the most important one was from a woman named Carol Vandergrift. On July 31st, 1987, 2 months before Kay's death, Carol was shot in the head when her estranged ex-husband, William Douglas Carter, broke into her home in Middleburg, Virginia. Carol survived the attack and was able to write William's name on the floor in her own blood before she received medical attention. After shooting Carol, William drove from Virginia to his horse farm in Saratoga Springs, New York at a very rapid pace and started making long-distance phone calls immediately after his arrival. He hoped that the phone records of these calls would provide him with an alibi, placing him in another state at the time his ex-wife was shot, but since Carol survived, his plan obviously did not work. William wound up being convicted of malicious wounding and illegal use of a firearm and received a 14-year prison sentence. While Carol was a longtime friend of Kay Hall's, and both Kay and Bob knew about the circumstances of her attempted murder, Carol found it incredibly suspicious that Kay was murdered only 2 months later, and that Bob placed a long-distance phone call from his home around the approximate time period Kay was killed. Carol firmly believed that Bob used her ex-husband's murder plot as inspiration for his own murder, and that his phone call was a deliberate attempt to place himself at another location and fabricate an alibi for himself. While the Virginia State Police believed that Carol's story was the final piece of evidence they needed to get an arrest warrant for Bob, so in January of 1990, he was finally charged with second-degree murder. Bob would go on trial in July of that year, but there would be a pretty unique complication. It turned out that Manuel Haney, one of the jurors at Bob's trial, had actually appeared as an actor in one of the reenactments from the Unsolved Mysteries segment about the case. Not only that, but Haney played one of the people who discovered Kay's body underneath her truck. Given the circumstances, this raised questions about whether Haney could remain a fair and impartial juror. 16 other prospective jurors had admitted to watching the Unsolved Mysteries segment, some of whom formed their own personal opinion about Bob's guilt or innocence, so none of them were selected. But in the end, Haney assured everyone that his appearance on the show did not influence his personal opinion, so he was allowed to remain on the jury. Anyway, once the trial began, the prosecution pushed forward the theory that shortly after returning home from the country club, Bob immediately climbed into his Jeep and went searching for Kay. He eventually found her, but another argument likely ensued which led to Bob going into a violent drunken rage and running over Kay with her own pickup truck. He then subsequently raced back home and placed a phone call in an attempt to establish an alibi. The prosecution would argue that Bob had used William Douglas Carter's murder plot as inspiration, and Carol Vandergrift would be called upon to testify and confirm that she shared her story with the Halls shortly before Kay was killed. Bob's defense team countered with the argument that Kay's death was not actually a murder at all, and that she was the victim of an unfortunate tragic accident. Shortly before her death, Kay had been arrested for a DUI. She was given a restricted driver's permit and was slated to begin a Virginia Alcohol Safety Action Program. Since Kay had a blood alcohol level of 0.2% and was last seen nearly crashing her pickup truck into a swimming pool, she was clearly in no shape to be driving on the night she was killed. The defense presented a scenario where Kay stopped her truck on Bluff Point Road and climbed out, before she was accidentally run over. Even though the transmission was in park at the time the truck was found, an engineer was called to testify who claimed he had examined the truck and discovered that the gear shift lever for the automatic transmission was faulty. He said the truck suffered from quote-unquote illusory park phenomenon, which would have caused it to accidentally shift into reverse from the park position and back over Kay's body a second time after she was already on the ground. However, the jury was ultimately not persuaded by this argument. After deliberating for 2.5 hours, they found Bob guilty of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The defense immediately appealed the conviction, and one of their arguments was that Carol Vandergrift's testimony about her own attempted murder had no real bearing on the case and unfairly prejudiced the jury. Well, the Virginia Court of Appeals agreed with this, so they overturned Bob's conviction and awarded him a new trial. Without Carol's testimony, the state's case against Bob was severely weakened, so he was offered an Alford plea, which would allow him to enter a guilty plea to second-degree murder while maintaining his innocence. In exchange, Bob's 20-year sentence would be shortened to time served, and he would receive 15 years probation before being released from prison. Bob agreed to the deal and became a free man again in April of 1992 after serving less than 2 years. Officially, the case is now considered to be closed, but questions still remain about whether Bob was actually responsible for Kay's murder. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, maybe the trail didn't actually go cold after all. Maybe they had the right guy all along, and he just got incredibly lucky. If Bob was guilty, getting off with less than 2 years in prison and 15 years probation for second-degree murder was a pretty good deal for him. People who are released from prison after submitting an Alford plea generally serve a lot more time before the case reaches that point. Even if Bob was innocent, I couldn't really blame him for taking this deal. I have no idea what happened to Bob after he was released, or if he's even still alive today, but regardless of whether he did it or not, they closed the book on this case for good after he walked free. Now, the Alford plea has been used in a number of high-profile cases, with some of the most famous examples being the West Memphis 3 case and the staircase murder of Kathleen Peterson. In fact, this podcast even featured another Unsolved Mysteries case which ended in this fashion, as Raymond Beaver Tempest was convicted of the murder of Doreen Picard, served 23 years before his conviction was overturned, and wound up entering an Alford plea last year rather than go on trial again. You can probably draw the most parallels between Bob Hall and Michael Peterson from the staircase murder, as both cases involved a husband being convicted of killing his wife, and his defense attorneys arguing that there was no foul play and the victim's death was accidental. I know the Alford plea can be the most immensely unsatisfying conclusion, since it pretty much ensures that the full truth about what happened will never be known. Even if the right person was put in prison the first time around, it must be difficult for the victim's family to see the alleged killer walk free in what can best be described as a compromise. It's clear that the state did not have much confidence that they'd be able to convict Bob Hall if they put him on trial again, but officially, an Alford plea still counts as a victory for them in the books. I remember watching the Unsolved Mysteries segment back when it originally aired, and my initial impression was that I could totally see why Bob was the prime suspect, but I also had doubts he would have been capable of committing the crime in such a narrow time frame. All that being said, a lot of the information I've shared in this episode which makes Bob look guilty was not mentioned on Unsolved Mysteries. I learned some of the most incriminating details about Bob, such as his constantly changing story and his weird quasi-confession to Special Agent Riley, by reading the official documentation from the Virginia Court of Appeals. The Unsolved Mysteries segment was probably a bit more ambiguous about Bob's guilt than he deserved, but I will say that even though the show featured a number of interviews with people suspected of murdering their spouse, Bob did come across better than most. But while he wasn't anywhere close to Jewel Kaler levels of douchebaggery, Bob was hardly an example of a great human being, as he was an ex-convict who was lucky enough to find a woman who was willing to financially support him, and I'm sure the allegations about him being physically abusive towards Kay are probably true. We know Kay inherited $50,000 on the very same day she was killed, and if she was going to use this as motivation to finally divorce Bob, I could totally see him going into a drunken rage and murdering her. There is most definitely motive here, but the big unanswered question is not the why, but the how. I do think there's a lot of evidence pointing to Bob's guilt which cannot be explained away. He mentioned Kay being run over by a truck before police even shared that detail with him. He was caught in a lie when he claimed that he never left his house that night, and changed his story once investigators told him his Jeep's engine was warm. And his interaction with Special Agent Riley about putting together a legal document which would absolve Kay's killer of any responsibility in her death is one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen a murder suspect do. You get the sense that Bob was anxious to make a confession and put the entire incident behind him, so he was fishing around to see if he could conceivably make a deal which would allow him to escape punishment. If Bob admitted to what he did, he probably would have gotten off with a light sentence, but it's apparent that he was attempting to orchestrate an arrangement where he could not only avoid prison time, but make a profit by collecting insurance money on Kay's death. Yeah, that's not how things work in the real world when you confess to murder. It's pretty jaw-dropping to read that Bob actually proposed the idea of burning down his house and committing insurance fraud to the lead investigator on his case and said, quote, "I bet I could do it in such a way they'll say it was an accident, just like we're doing in this." End quote. I know that when Bob went on trial, his defense team tried to spin this as Bob making an attempt to lead Riley on, but it's still sketchy as hell. The primary evidence against Bob at his trial was Carol Vandergrift's testimony that only 2 months before Kay's death, her ex-husband, William Douglas Carter, tried to kill her before traveling to another location and making phone calls from there to fabricate an alibi for himself. Since the Halls knew about this incident beforehand, the prosecution inferred that Bob borrowed this idea, which is why he placed a phone call immediately after arriving home following Kay's murder. However, the Court of Appeals believed this assertion was based entirely on speculation and should not have been used as evidence against Bob at trial. Well, here's an interesting postscript to that case. William Douglas Carter also had his conviction overturned. In fact, this occurred only 1 month before Bob's conviction was reversed. It turned out that the prosecution at Carter's original trial withheld a statement from a county deputy who claimed that Carol Vandergrift once told him that she was so bitter against her ex-husband that she would shoot herself if, quote-unquote, I could make it look like he did it. Since this statement was never disclosed to Carter's defense team, this constituted prosecutorial misconduct. Carter wound up getting a retrial in July of 1992, and this time, he was acquitted. In spite of this, I personally still think that Carter was guilty, and I don't believe his ex-wife shot herself in the head to frame him. Regardless, I'm not sure if it really affects Bob's case that much, because he still had knowledge of this crime beforehand, and could have used it as inspiration when he killed Kay. It is quite a coincidence that these similar cases occurred only 2 months apart, and I guess a lot would depend on the context of Bob's phone call to his daughter that night. If there was a logical reason for this call, that would be one thing, but if Bob just phoned her up out of the blue at 9:47 in the evening to say hi, then it could easily be inferred that he was making a deliberate attempt to have this call show up on his phone records, placing him at his residence, and potentially providing him with an alibi. But the problem is that this is purely speculative, it cannot be proven, so I can see why the Court of Appeals ruled that Carol Vandergrift's testimony unfairly influenced the jury. One of the biggest obstacles to believing in Bob's innocence is trying to concoct a plausible alternate explanation for what happened to Kay. At trial, the defense team tried to push forward the theory that Kay's death was an accident. Kay was clearly in no condition to drive that night, seeing as how she nearly crashed her truck into a swimming pool. If for whatever reason, Kay pulled over to the side of Bluff Point Road, climbed out of the truck, and walked around behind it, a faulty gear shift may have given Kay the mistaken impression that the truck was in park and caused it to back into her and run over her body. But I don't know. I guess that scenario is not impossible, but what reason would Kay have to exit her truck on that particular road and walk around behind it? You also can't overlook the broken necklace and fake fingernails inside the cab, which seems to support a violent struggle taking place there. It just seems more likely that someone else threw Kay out of the truck, took the wheel, and then intentionally backed over her. And if that person wasn't Bob, who could it have been? The investigation never uncovered any strong alternate suspects or anyone else in Kay's life who seemed to have a motive to kill her. So did Kay just happen to cross paths with a random killer on that back road who decided to murder her with her own truck? Maybe, but since there was no sexual assault or robbery, what motive would a stranger have had to kill her? Even though the Virginia Court of Appeals overturned Bob's conviction, they did acknowledge in their official decision that he had the motive and opportunity to kill his wife. But while that's technically true, the biggest issue with sending Bob to prison for this crime is that he cannot actually be placed at the murder scene. There was no physical evidence to implicate Bob, and even if his fingerprints, hair, or DNA were found inside Kay's truck, that wouldn't prove anything, since he used it all the time, and was inside the truck only a few hours beforehand when Kay drove him to the country club. No witnesses could place Bob on Bluff Point Road, and the only vehicle which witnesses recalled seeing in the area that night was the pickup truck. We know there's a 1-hour window of time in which Bob's whereabouts are unaccounted for, and when you factor in the time it would have taken him to drive to the murder scene and back, that leaves only about 15 to 25 minutes for him to find Kay and kill her. That could certainly be done, but the biggest unanswered question which has always nagged at me is, how did Bob know Kay would be at that particular location? It's easy to assume that once Bob learned Kay was inheriting $50,000 that morning, he decided this would be the ideal time to kill her. When he remembered William Douglas Carter placing a phone call in order to establish an alibi, he used that as inspiration to pull off the perfect murder. Well, the problem with this theory is that Bob's entire plan would have revolved around an event he couldn't have anticipated beforehand, as Kay became so incensed by an argument they had at the country club that she stormed out of the party and drove away, leaving Bob stranded without a ride. The details are sketchy, but it sounds like the argument ensued over Bob giving a large tip to the bartender. While that may sound like a ridiculous reason for Kay to drive off, it apparently wasn't unusual for the Halls to get into heated fights over trivial things, particularly if they had been drinking. But where did Kay go after she left? The Halls' home was 14 miles west of the club, but the spot on Bluff Point Road where she was killed was 2 miles east in the opposite direction. As far as the timeline goes, we have Kay leaving the club sometime between 8 o'clock and 8:15, a witness seeing her nearly drive into a pool at around 8:50, and while we don't know the exact time of Kay's death, she was discovered at 9:55. It seems like she was alive for at least an hour or so after she left the club, but what exactly was she doing? It's been theorized that because of her intoxication, Kay might have taken a wrong turn somewhere and gotten lost, which is plausible, but if Bob was the killer, then you have to account for how he was able to track her down. When Bob was dropped off at home at 8:45, he would have seen that Kay was not there, so this could have compelled him to climb into his Jeep and go out searching for her. But you have to remember that this was the pre-cell phone era of 1987. We know that Kay couldn't have told Bob where she was, unless she called him at home on a payphone or something, but since we know the phone records for the Hall residents were checked, I'm pretty sure this did not happen. There was also no GPS back then, so Bob would pretty much have to spend his time randomly driving around in the dark looking for her. He definitely could have crossed paths with her on Bluff Point Road, but a lot of luck would need to go Bob's way for him to find her in a relatively short amount of time. Now, we know that Special Agent Riley drove the route from the Hall residence to the murder scene on multiple occasions, and it took him anywhere between 17 and 24 minutes, giving Bob a window of around 15 to 25 minutes to kill Kay and return home in time for his 9:47 phone call. We've seen this type of test performed during a number of murder cases where they've needed to retrace a suspect's alleged route and determine if they had enough time to travel from point A to point B. Hell, an entire episode of Serial was based around this. But the problem with these tests is that they can't accurately recreate the exact circumstances of when the original drive took place. There are two major flaws with the test performed by Riley. A. Bob Hall was intoxicated at the time Kay's death took place. If he made the drive, he would have done so at night and been searching for Kay in the dark which are not exactly ideal circumstances when you're trying to find someone. Unless he's incredibly irresponsible, I'm sure Riley was stone cold sober whenever he made the drive, which skews the results a little bit. And B, when Riley drove the route, he knew his exact destination. For all we know, Bob did not. How could he be so certain that after leaving the club, Kay would wind up 2 miles in the opposite direction? If Bob dreamed up this premeditated murder plan, which involved tracking down his wife, killing her, and returning home as quickly as possible to place a phone call, the whole thing would fall apart if he had to drive around aimlessly for several hours because he couldn't find her. However, the most plausible alternate explanation is that this wasn't a premeditated murder plot, and Bob did not originally intend to kill Kay that night. I think it's likely that when Bob was dropped off at home and saw that Kay wasn't there, he immediately went searching for her. Since he last saw Kay leaving the country club, he probably instinctively decided to return to that area. Perhaps Bob had reasons to believe that Kay might be on Bluff Point Road, or perhaps it was just happenstance that he found her there, but when he tracked her down, they picked up right where they left off at the club and got into a fight. Perhaps they were arguing together inside the cab of the pickup truck when Kay told Bob she was divorcing him and kicking him out of their house. This set Bob off and caused things to escalate into violence. A scuffle then ensued which prompted Bob to push Kay out of the truck and take the wheel before backing right into her and running her over. This was probably more of a heat-of-the-moment crime of passion, and Bob was not planning for this to happen when he first arrived there. After realizing what he's done, the details of the recent attempted murder of Carol Vandergrift suddenly pop into Bob's mind. Unlike that case, Bob knows for certain that Kay did not survive and cannot point the finger at him, so he climbs into his Jeep, races back home as fast as he can, and immediately phones his daughter, which creates an official record of him being at his residence at 9:47. I think Bob probably caught an unlucky break when Kay's body was discovered only a few minutes later at 9:55, and since her body was still warm, everyone knew she was killed only a short time before she was found. If Kay's body had remained undiscovered on the road for several more hours, it might have been more difficult to pinpoint her exact time of death, and Bob's alibi placing him at home at 9:47 might have held up better. I definitely think this is the most likely theory for what happened, but once again, the problem is that's purely speculative and not evidence you can use against him in a court of law. We know that Bob was lying and changing his story about his whereabouts that night, but it still doesn't prove that he was on Bluff Point Road murdering his wife. In the end, there just wasn't enough evidence to prove Bob's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, so I can't really disagree with the Court of Appeal's decision to overturn his conviction. There's a lot of frustration involved when you can present a compelling case for why a defendant committed a crime, but you just can't present an airtight theory explaining how they did it. I pretty much feel the same way about the Kathleen Peterson staircase murder. I do believe that Michael Peterson did kill her, but the state's case against him was very flawed, to say the least, and their theory of how he committed the crime wound up completely falling apart. If they took him to trial again, they might not have been able to secure a conviction, so I can see why they were willing to negotiate an Alford plea. And it's pretty much the same thing with Bob Hall's case. The fact that the state was willing to let Bob enter an Alford plea and walk free after serving less than 2 years for second-degree murder shows that they really didn't have much faith in their ability to convict him again, and that this was the best way for them to save face. So yeah, this is ultimately an unsatisfying end to a very tragic case. I don't really feel that much sympathy for Bob, but I do feel really bad for Kay's family. They watched the man they believe to be her killer go free after serving a very light sentence, and since he can never be tried for the same crime again, Kay did not receive justice. But at the same time, the system technically did what it was supposed to do in these situations, because even though Bob was probably guilty, he did not receive a fair trial, and there was still reasonable doubt. I essentially considered this case to be solved, but I would still be curious to learn the exact circumstances of what happened and how Bob managed to find Kay that night and pull this crime off. But unless Bob decides to make a full confession, which doesn't seem likely at this point, we'll probably never learn the full truth. So while the trail is definitely not cold on this case, there are still a few unanswered questions. Anyway, that wraps up this month's bonus episode. Thank you all so much for listening and supporting us on Patreon. Have yourself a good month, and join us again in December for our next bonus episode of The Trail Went Cold.